you ever heard about the 7 Gates of Hell? It's this super famous spooky place in rural Pennsylvania that lots of people talk about and tell scary stories about. Even though I lived only 15 miles away, I didn't realize how many folks from all over the country visit it. I never really believed in paranormal stuff, ghosts and things you can't really see or touch. I always needed solid proof. But my friends were totally into finding proof of ghosts, demons, and all that spooky stuff. We were in the 10th grade, and our evenings were all about ghost hunting adventures. We'd go into the woods behind Maddie's house, use a pendulum to talk to spirits, mess around with a Ouija board, and even try to make a summoning portal using kitchen stuff. None of it ever really worked, though. The pendulum would swing, but it was probably just the wind, and Ouija boards are just controlled by whoever's touching them. I was always there, playing along and having fun, but I never really believed in any of it. That's why when Kenny suggested going to the 7 Gates of Hell, I was totally up for it. Besides being full of spooky stories, there was a real history to it. Back in the 1800s, there was an asylum in Pelham, Pennsylvania. Back then, people in asylums didn't get treated very well, especially before 1900. One evening, the asylum caught fire and burned down. It was in the middle of the woods, so it took firefighters over 20 minutes to get there. By then, it was too late. Many people in the asylum didn't make it. Some burned alive, others escaped into the forest but ended up dying from smoke or animals. It was really sad and scary. I wanted to see the leftover parts of the asylum that people said were still there past the 6th gate. So, on a Friday night, we left home at 10 p.m. to try to get to the asylum by 3 a.m., which they called the witching hour. There were 5 of us, Kenny, Maddie, Andrew, Lauren, and me, all squeezed into Kenny's single-row pickup truck. I asked, "What are you guys hoping to find out there?" I knew there were supposed to be ghosts of asylum inmates, but I didn't know much else. Kenny said, the usual. Ghosts, demons, whatever wants to show itself to us. At first, Maddie and Lauren seemed a bit tense, which was weird because we did this kind of thing all the time. Then Lauren spoke up, "Well, it depends on how deep into the woods we get." I heard Anders and Lawrence went by themselves last week and couldn't even get past the 3rd gate. They said they started hearing voices and seeing eyes in the woods. It really spooked them. I tried not to laugh because Anders and Lawrence were basically the class clowns in our high school, and it was hard to take anything they said seriously. "Yeah, and I've heard that if you can make it past the 7th gate, then you get sent directly to hell, never to return," Maddie said, her eyes checking the woods on our right. "Assuming that hell is real, that is," I added, earning a playful punch from Andrew. After a 45-minute drive, we reached the broken-down street sign that said Toad Road, where the gates were supposed to begin. "Okay, everyone, be quiet. Do you all have your flashlights and knives?" Kenny asked. We were told to bring flashlights for obvious reasons, and I guess knives were for feeling safer from ghosts. I brought one just in case of a coyote, which were more common in the area than I'd like to remember, an actual threat. We all nodded to show we had our 2 items. Great. About 1/8 of a mile into the forest, there should be a rusted gate. That's the 1st gate, and once we cross it, we'll be in the devil's territory, Kenny said, smirking. I hope he's ready. I rolled my eyes and gave a reassuring smile to Maddie, who still looked a bit nervous. I put my arm around her and whispered that everything was going to be all right. Maybe they would finally find something real, and we could move on from this silly paranormal stuff to the next fad. Soon, Kenny turned around and led us into the woods. It took about 5 minutes to get to the gate he talked about. I didn't really get why it was a big deal. The rusted iron gate was just sitting in the woods, not connected to anything, covered in vines and weeds. But hey, you find scrap metal everywhere, right? The others seemed both excited and nervous. I asked, "So what's supposed to happen after we cross?" I was getting ready for some made-up stuff I'd experience soon. Kenny explained, the first gate isn't much. Since we're farthest from the asylum, there are supposed to be fewer spirits here. They might try to push you around, so you might feel some pressure. Oh, and our phones will probably stop working here. Electronics don't work in the gates. So stay close, and if you get separated, just go back to the car so you don't get lost. I left it unlocked since we're in the middle of nowhere. Kenny banged his flashlight on the gate, making bits of rust fly into the air. Then, with a big performance, he stepped to the other side of the gate. I followed, and then the rest of the group did too. No surprise, I didn't feel any different. We walked a bit more, and when I tried to check my phone, it had turned off. Weird, because the battery was almost 80% when we left the car. I guess cell service just doesn't work this far out in the country. So, are all your phones actually off? I asked, making sure I wasn't the only one. One by one, they checked, and one by one, they agreed with me. I was more worried about us getting separated than thinking maybe this was some spooky thing. Maddie was especially scared. Guys, I don't know. This feels a little too real for me, Maddie said nervously, looking back the way we came, probably thinking about whether going to wait in the car and being called a baby by the rest of the group was worth it. Oh, stop, it's fine. Worst comes to worst, we all die in a poltergeist extravaganza. Kenny said, not helping. We kept walking. The next gate was about a mile away, and we weren't going super fast. So Kenny, what's supposed to happen-UCH? Andrew stopped himself mid-sentence and looked down at his leg. He pulled up his jeans, showing a big cut about 4 inches long on the back of his lower leg. What happened? I asked, shining my flashlight around, trying to find any thorn bushes or something. I felt a light tapping on my shoulder and turned around to see who it was, only to find no one there. Maddie, Lauren, and Kenny were all standing next to Andrew, and I was alone where I stood. Okay. Weird. I'll admit. I don't know, I was just walking, and it hurt, then this, Andrew said, pointing to his leg. I mean, it's not that bad, just unexpected. Let's keep going. We reached the next gate a few minutes later. Only Maddie complained about feeling like she was getting shoved to the side. She said it felt like when someone leans into you while walking. She was scared, but sometimes when you expect something spooky, you might feel it even if it's not really there. I chose to ignore that. Alright, gate 2 is right here. On the other side of this gate, according to legend, you start feeling like you're being followed, the pushing continues, only stronger. Oh, and there's a cult that guards the third gate at the end. So, watch out for them, Kenny said, not feeling any weird stuff during the first gate and being more lighthearted than the rest of us. We pressed on without questioning him. Halfway through the second gate, we hit our first problem. Maddie's flashlight died. She swore she had fresh batteries, but still, we were short one. Maddie huddled close to me and used the light from mine as we followed the imaginary path Kenny was leading. About a quarter of a mile past the second gate, we heard a scream. I whipped around and saw Lauren on the ground, her eyes wild as she looked back and forth so quickly I was afraid she might hurt herself. We all looked at her with curiosity. I don't know what happened, it felt like someone just speared me. Lauren shouted, panic growing in her voice. I walked over to her and offered her a hand to get up. I'm serious, guys. It felt like I got tackled. I didn't just dive onto the ground and scream for no reason. Lauren shook off my hand and pushed herself up, rejoining us with shock on her face, and Andrew's. Kenny clearly didn't believe her, and Maddie looked like she was on the verge of tears. As we walked, I started feeling like I was being stalked. I looked around for signs of a coyote, thinking it might be that, but I couldn't see anything that would tell me there was wildlife around. Actually, Now that I thought about it, there wasn't much wildlife at all. Guys, hold up for a second, be quiet, I asked everyone, and they were happy to stop. Not that anyone was talking much anyway. As everyone stayed quiet, I felt a pit in my stomach growing. There wasn't a single noise. No crickets, no wind, no leaves cracking in the distance. Complete silence. That's strange, isn't it? The lack of sound? I voiced my concerns aloud. I really think we should turn back. That feeling of being shoved down? That was enough for me. I don't want to mess with this stuff anymore. I'm serious. Lauren shivered as she spoke, even though it was a relatively warm night. Honestly, I'm down to turn around too. It's getting pretty late, Andrew said. His eyes weren't necessarily scared, but they were definitely on edge. Are you all being serious right now? Come on, we drove all the way here. We are not turning back now, Kenny said, sounding disappointed. He threw his hands in the air in frustration. No, I think we should keep going. I just thought it was weird as all, I replied. Right after I said that, I felt it again, the tapping on my shoulder, like someone trying to get my attention without speaking. I turned my head, expecting to see nothing, and wasn't surprised when there was nothing there. How much further to the third gate? It should be right around here, let's go. Kenny swung his flashlight around and started walking again, not giving anyone else the chance to disagree. After another 2 or 3 minutes, we ended up on a road that seemed to appear out of nowhere. There was no traffic sound, and the road didn't have any paint on it, just concrete in the wilderness. The feeling of being watched was almost overwhelming now, and I have to admit, it started freaking me out a little bit at this point. In the distance, I could see another gate at the end of the road. This one felt different, maybe because it was less rusty and old-looking, or perhaps because it was in a place that made sense for a gate, not in the middle of the forest. Somehow, it just felt strange. When we were about 10 yards away from the gate, I heard Maddie start to sob. I turned to ask her what was wrong, and I saw sheer terror in her eyes. I will never forget that look. I asked what was wrong, and she couldn't even speak. She just pointed to the sides of the road. In the darkness where the road dropped off into more grass and trees, just along the edge of our vision, were bright green eyes. Hundreds of them. Part 2. It only took 5 seconds for the rest of our small group to see what Maddie did. Those green eyes were unnaturally bright in the darkness of the forest around them. Lauren let out a shriek, and Andrew practically jumped out of his skin, even though he didn't actually scream. I swear Kenny actually smiled, as if he was happy to finally have something to talk about. But his smile didn't last long. I knew he wanted to see something metaphysical more than any of the rest of us, but even for him, this felt like more than we bargained for. One by one, what felt like thousands of men stepped out of the shrubbery on either side of the road, each holding some sort of weapon. My heart dropped. Maddie clung to me, her face buried in my chest, sobbing. Andrew looked distant, like his brain couldn't process the situation. Lauren was crying silent tears, and Kenny had an awful grimace from trying to look like he wasn't scared to keep his social status, but he was actually scared out of his mind. The figures were quiet as they came closer. They looked like people, but something about them was off. Maybe it was that they seemed darker than they should, even as our flashlights reached them. Or maybe it was the way they floated instead of walked, or the subtle static noise they made. It was a small, white noise like static, but it seemed loud after not hearing any noise for the last 45 minutes. 3 figures positioned themselves between us and the third gate, never breaking their gaze from ours. One stepped forward, holding what looked like a shotgun, while the other 2 had big clubs made of wood and scrap metal. "You will turn around." Now, the voice didn't come from the man with the shotgun, but boomed through the air, like the world itself was talking to us. Of course, my first instinct was to turn around and leave, and so did everyone else who was sane in our group. But Kenny just stared ahead with more purpose than I'd ever seen. He had finally done it, contacted and seen something from another world. We all had. But unlike the rest of us, it didn't scare Kenny. It made him want to know more. No, we're gonna keep going. This is public land. You can't stop us. I don't believe you'll pull that trigger. Kenny talked back to the creatures with calm confidence. He really meant what he was saying, and I couldn't understand how. I fought every urge to turn around and run, walking forward to put my hand on Kenny's shoulder. We need to go, man. I don't think these guys are messing around. We need to go, I said, putting emphasis at the end, hoping that my good friend was just in some kind of shock-induced overconfidence. I turned him around to look at the rest of us instead of them. Look at Maddie and Lauren, I pointed at the two girls. Maddie had her head in her hands, trying to avoid looking around, and Lauren sat next to her, trying to act tough and not doing a great job. What, do you want to chicken out, just like Anders? This is all meant to scare us, okay, Daniel? Nothing is gonna happen, Dash. A crack once again pierced the night, and I instantly knew the shotgun had been fired. I didn't even have time to scream before Kenny was gone. I don't mean gone as in dead, I mean gone. Disappeared. There was no trace of him. One moment he was talking to me, and the next, my hand was no longer on the shoulder of my childhood best friend. It was just floating through the air back to my side. The figures were gone too. Kenny? Kenny! I shouted into the nothingness. The sound was gone again, along with the creatures, so my voice felt like it would travel for miles, but nothing came back. I turned back to everyone else, and they looked as scared as I was. Where is he, Daniel? He was just right there. You had your hand on his shoulder, Daniel. Where is he? Andrew was now in front of me, poking his finger into my chest as if somehow I was the one that caused this. I started. That's not true. Andrew shoved me hard enough that I stumbled backward and almost fell over. People don't just disappear. His anger quickly turned into worry as he walked over to where Kenny was just a few moments before and dropped to his knees. We have to leave now, tell the police what happened. I don't know. We can't just leave him out here, Andrew. We have to keep going. It was Lauren who spoke this. The determined look on her face was much different than the one she had a minute ago. She was right. If we left right now, Kenny might as well be gone forever. He still might be, but if we keep going, maybe we can find those creatures again and try to make a deal. I really wanted to leave this forest and never come back, but now, we didn't have a choice. Maddie looked up for the first time since the dark men arrived, her whole face red, and tears staining her cheeks. When she spoke, her voice cracked, and she sniffed to try to stop her nose from running, but it didn't work. I don't want to, I just want to go home. She sounded defeated, and I didn't blame her. But unless she wanted to walk back through the woods alone, she was going to have to get through it. Kenny needed us. I'm sorry, Maddie. I know you're scared. We all are. But we have to do this right now. We have to. We have to. I said it twice, once for Maddie, and once for myself. She looked back at me like a little kid being told she was going to be in trouble, but she nodded her head and let out another burst of tears before eventually standing on her own. Without giving myself more time to think about it, I walked up to the third gate, put my hand on it, and walked around to the other side. The others followed me, even though they were hesitant. The road we had been walking on disappeared right on the other side of the third gate, so we were back to walking through the woods and keeping our eyes out for anything that might be hiding in the trees. I took the lead with Maddie constantly at my side, followed by Andrew and Lauren. We walked in a tight square, moving forward. It was strange, but somehow I just knew where to go. It felt like I was being guided, but by a force that I couldn't see or feel. I found myself making turns around certain trees and crossing over a small stream at one point, even though it would have been easier to just walk alongside it. The tapping that I had felt on my shoulder before was getting stronger and harder to ignore. It was persistent now, and the taps were becoming harder and more painful. I could tell that the others were feeling something similar. Even though we didn't say anything to each other, all three of my friends would occasionally wince, hold a part of their body, or turn their heads to look in a direction for no apparent reason. To their credit, especially poor Maddie, no one said a word. We walked in silence for about 15 more minutes before we heard a scream. It was far away, maybe about 50 yards, but it was tough to tell with the lack of other sounds. Andrew and Lauren started running towards the scream to call for help, and I quickly followed. They were a bit ahead of us, and when we reached a clearing, the two in front of us stopped suddenly, nearly causing Maddie and me to run straight into their backs. Andrew's hand covered his mouth, and Lauren turned away to vomit. I looked past them and saw my own mother being stabbed repeatedly by what I can only describe as a monster. It was pitch black like a shadow, with twisted blades for hands and long, dog-like legs bent in directions that didn't make any sense. "Mom!" I screamed, almost as terrified as she was. I rushed forward and tried to tackle the creature attacking my mother, but right as I was about to hit it, it disappeared right in front of my eyes. I turned to find my mother, but she had been replaced with another face. An old man with blood running down his lips, looking at me with a devilish smile. He licked his lips as he stared at me and then vanished himself. It took me a minute before I could move again. I had no idea what was real. Was this all a crazy picture in my mind? It couldn't be because everyone else saw the same thing as I did. I had no answers and no clue what to make of the events that had happened. I fought back the urge to scream and vomit and walked back to our group. "What are we even gonna do, if we find him?" Andrew said, his eyes still fixed on the ground where we had just seen two more beings disappear. "We're gonna find and stop whoever took him," Lauren spoke up, everything about her turned to ice. It almost made me more uncomfortable seeing the sweet, pretty girl who liked watching makeup tutorials on YouTube and flirting with boys on Twitter look as tough and emotionally shut off as it did seeing the spirits. Almost. With a new sense of pace, we started back on the trail. My flashlight flicked back and forth between the trail in front of me and the trees beside me even more often now, and it wasn't long before we reached the fourth gate. Or at least, I think it was the fourth gate. There wasn't actually a gate, just a mark in the ground like someone had run their finger through wet concrete and shaped it that way. I just knew it was, though. I knew we were getting deeper into the game, closer to hell, I suppose. I didn't even bother to stop, I just kept walking. The moment I stepped past the gate, I knew I was right. It felt like it got 20 degrees colder instantly. I also heard sound again, but it wasn't the usual forest sounds. They were distant wails, like the wind in a scary movie, but scarier. When Maddie stepped over the line, her face froze, and she looked at me. I tried to smile for reassurance, but I'm sure it wasn't worth much. She put her head back down and pulled her jacket closer around her. "Are we gonna talk about how we made it here? To the fourth gate? With no directions?" Andrew was looking at me, then pointed back down at the line in the dirt. "I mean, of all the turns we could have taken, all the different routes we could have gone down. This gate is hardly 6 feet long in a forest that's how big? And how in the world did we even know this was supposed to be a gate? I can't be the only one who just knew." Andrew was ranting, something he did to cope with things. Normally it was when a guy at school made him mad by talking to a girl he liked, or when his favorite football team lost, blaming it all on the referees. This time it was about ghosts that kidnapped and possibly killed our best friend. I don't have an answer, let's just keep moving, okay? "I don't want to stand in one place for too long," I replied. "Forget this." Andrew crossed his arms and shivered from the newfound cold but kept walking ahead of me. Lauren just walked by his side and looked straight ahead, focused on some unknown point, her mind set only on finishing her objective. The more we got into the land of the fourth gate, the harder it was to ignore the background noise during our walk. It was definitely screaming, and it was clearly coming from the direction we were heading. Then again, I guess we had given up rational thought the moment we decided to keep going deeper into this darn forest instead of turning around and cutting our losses with just one of us. I know it might sound strange to say, but I'm worried that even if we make it out of here, our lives will never be the same again. I know mine won't be. I don't really remember when, but at some point, images started flashing through my head. They weren't my own. I saw ashen monsters, endless miles of snow, and millions of spiders crawling along the ground. They were terrifying, and they would flash in front of my mind every couple of minutes for a brief moment. It was distracting, and I wanted them to stop. After a while, I started cringing every time I knew another one was due. As we went deeper, the visions got longer. Eventually, all I could do was focus on walking straight. My gut instinct was to sit down and close my eyes to try to make it stop. I knew that wouldn't help, but I had the strongest urge to do it anyway. I persisted. I kept moving. I fixed my eyes on the back of Andrew's head and grounded myself there. During one of these strange visions, where I imagined flying with fiery wings and a feeling that I would soon fall to my death, I heard Maddie scream again. I snapped back to reality and looked to my right, where she had been standing all evening. She was gone, but not like Kenny. This time there was a trail of blood. I don't think that makes it better. Please, help. I followed the voice up a tree and saw Maddie pinned to the trunk, a thick branch going through her stomach. I crossed the distance between us in moments and looked up. She was out of my reach, and her eyes were closing quickly. Maddie, please, stay with us. We can help. I yelled up to her, desperately thinking of any solution. I whipped around to find Lauren climbing a dogwood next to the one Maddie was impaled on. Andrew and I looked on helplessly. I got you, Maddie, I got you. Lauren's voice was reassuring as she worked her way about 15 feet off the ground to a crossing point between the two trees. I had forgotten how good of a climber Lauren had been in elementary school. It felt like ages ago, but it sure was useful now. Lauren reached over and made the jump. Maddie followed her lazily, a drunken haze settling over her whole body. Lauren began to slowly climb down to the level our friend was at and cradled her head. Then, she looked back down at us and shook her head. There was nothing we could do. You have to try, Lauren. Please get her down. I begged, unable to handle another loss. Lauren grimaced and did the only thing that could possibly save her. She broke the branches close to Maddie's body as she could and pulled her off. I'm not sure if she managed to pull her the whole way off the tree branch. It wasn't long after Lauren touched her. Maddie disappeared into thin air. Part 3. I sat down on my knees and cried. With Kenny, we could tell ourselves that he was still alive somewhere, just kidnapped by some mysterious force, waiting for us to save him. Maddie was dead. I don't know where her body went, but I could see the life drain from her eyes when she was up on that tree. I don't think I will ever get the image out of my head. Can you imagine? Seeing your best friend, one who begged you to leave and that you forced to keep going, impaled on a tree limb, screaming for her life. Knowing you couldn't save her? There wasn't much time for grieving, however. Whatever lived in this forest didn't care about feelings. I only had about a minute of freedom before the visions started again. Piles of bones, my home being swallowed by an earthquake, creatures of indescribable horror chasing after me. The pressure that I felt pushing me forward didn't stop either. I could feel it pick me up from below my armpits, literally, mind you, and shove me forward. Lauren made her way down from the spot she had been trying to rescue Maddie, no expression on her face, and walked right past me in the direction that I had been shoved. Clearly she was getting directions too. Andrew put his head down and walked behind her, leaving me as the last to follow. I took one last glance back and continued on. There was nothing else I could do. The fifth gate didn't exist, at least physically. No one had spoken a word for the mile walk after Maddie's death until eventually Lauren spoke. We just passed the fifth gate. Of course, I felt it too. Instead of feeling hands tapping or shoving, it now felt like a constant pressure. Like when you were 5 years old and your 6 feet 8 inches uncle gave you a bear hug. Only then you knew it would eventually end. The visions have gotten increasingly worse, but I'm starting to become numb to them. They're just a part of me now. I've accepted that. I hadn't noticed it, but the terrain around us was changing as well. Things around us were just dead. Now, the trees were growing more and more brown, leaves becoming more scarce as we continued on. Plants with blooming flowers were replaced with thickets of thorn brush. Animal carcasses littered the distance. It seemed unlikely that we were even still in an earthly plane anymore, the more I thought about it. Something like this would have garnered the attention of the local government in an attempt to stop whatever was causing the death, and as far as I could remember when we were looking at Google Maps of the area, there was no such large lifeless area. It wasn't long until we saw the eyes again. It felt less eerie this time around, and more sinister. As if the surrounding forest wasn't enough, as soon as I saw the bright green glow around us I felt the depth of the place. It weighed on me like 1,000 pounds. I glanced at my friends. Andrew was darting his head back and forth in all directions, while Lauren kept her focus straight ahead, ignoring her surroundings completely as she had been for what seemed like years. You have one last chance. The same voice as before at the third gate boomed through the air like a tornado. None of us listened. Moments later, the dark figures appeared again, weapons in hand. They were more grisly this time, however. No longer shrouded in dark capes, but rather flaunting their unnatural bodies to us. Their limbs were too long, bodies too thick, and worst of all, their skin was pulled so taut against their bones that it looked like a demon summoned from a sacrificial ritual. I guess, in a way, they were. They had only appeared for a moment before they rushed at us. Unlike the previous encounter, where they had stood still and simply waited, this time they came at us from all sides, sprinting. I immediately sprung into a sprint forward of my own, Lauren and Andrew doing the same. We need to find a way through. I shouted, even though I was only a foot or two behind. The white noise emitting from the creatures was deafening. Split, that, can't reach. All I could only hear bits and pieces of what Lauren was saying, but her message was clear. She wanted us to split up, each running in a different direction, so that hopefully they would chase one and leave the others. I couldn't have disagreed more. Someone will die, Lauren. We have to stay together. I screamed back. Like hell was I going to lose another person to this damn forest. One. Us. All I overheard. She thought it was going to either be one of us or all of us. She was probably right, but that didn't make it okay. I just ran as hard as I could behind her. The creatures were closing in, and I had just managed to sneak by one of the incoming demons in front of us as he swung his club at me by dodging to the left. It wasn't going to last though. I was running out of steam, and fast. That, along with the fact that I had no idea how long we would have to outrun these things, or if we even could, made me want to give up. Maybe it would be easier to just give in. Let this nightmare be over. The thought of Maddie and Kenny was enough to pull me through. I pictured Maddie's face as she breathed her last breath, and the look of determination in Kenny's eyes as he stared down these dark men the first time. I had to keep going. Suddenly, Andrew stopped. It nearly knocked me over as I tried to pull him with me, but he didn't budge. Andrew, what are you doing? Come on. We have to move. I shook him, and he just shook his head at me. I can't do it, Daniel. I give up. A single tear fell from his right eye, and he sat on the ground. The demons were nearly on us from the back now. I grabbed my friend's arm and pulled harder, trying to force his hand, but he was dead weight. Go on. Lauren needs to. Save them. I'm sorry. Andrew turned around and ran towards the creatures that were coming from the back and threw his body into them. I hadn't even noticed that the ones in front of us had reached me as well, but they just ran straight past, all converging on Andrew, tearing his body apart limb from limb until there was nothing left. I couldn't watch, so I spun around and sprinted forward again. I took one last glance behind me as I caught up to Lauren, only to see what was left of Andrew disappear, just as the others had, along with the dark men. How do we do this, Lauren? I asked, stopping momentarily to catch my breath. We are dead already, Daniel. Don't you get that? It wasn't a question. I saw no sympathy for our mutual friend in her face, no remorse. Then, without another word, she walked again. Onward towards the next gate. One step closer to hell. If you didn't count what we were in as hell already, that is. The sixth gate came and passed. I didn't say a word, neither did she. I don't think either of us really know what we are going on for at this point. I've given up on saving them. I guess I only move forward because it seems a waste to go back. The visions have completely taken over my sight. I only see horrors now, and my legs walk on their own. The silence of the forest has been completely replaced by screams of agony and anguish. I look down at my arms, during a brief moment of clarity, to find them covered in bone-deep gashes, and bruises that are dark and large. I chuckle to myself, despite everything. I didn't even feel these injuries. At least if I die, it will be painless. We traveled for hours, and eventually that little presence that had been guiding us the whole time went away too. We wandered aimlessly, with no way of knowing where the seventh gate would be. The final gate. I tried for a moment to think about it logically, but it was hard to do anything besides concentrate on not going insane. Finally, it came to me. Each gate had some sort of trial, an attempt by the forest to get us to leave. Gate 1 was our phones going off. Enough to dissuade some, but not us. Gate 2 was the first presence of the supernatural, when we all knew this wasn't normal. Gate 3, the first appearance of the dark men, and the loss of Kenny. 4, Maddie. 5, Andrew. The thought popped into my mind at the same time as it did to Lauren. Undoubtedly from whatever devil source has been guiding us this whole time. Only one can go on. I tried to ignore it. Lauren didn't. She spun around only a moment after the voice rattled through our heads and clocked me straight in the jaw. She was a small girl, but it was enough force to send me to my knees. What are you doing? We can dash another punch to the temple. This time my vision blacked out, and I curled up into a ball on the ground. No. The forest has rules. You play by them, or you die. How haven't you learned? She shouted, before sending a kick to my exposed back. I began to cry. Another kick, then another. Finally, she turned me over and knelt over top of me, resting her thumbs against my eyes. You were always weak, Daniel. Lauren spoke, and then began jamming her thumbs into my eye sockets. I can't begin to describe the pain. It's unimaginable, even with the torment I have experienced in the last 8 hours. My body responded, rolling to the side and throwing Lauren off balanced enough for me to push her away. I grabbed my head and tried to think. I didn't have long before she was on top of me again, her arms around my neck this time, trying to choke me. I threw her off again, begging her to stop and think, figure out a logical solution. She was having none of it. She came back again, and again. Each time I threw her away, using my size and strength to my own advantage. I could tell she was tiring. Her attempts were getting weaker and weaker. She came at me again, and I threw her again. This time, she didn't get up. I walked over to her, my hands still massaging my eyes, trying to get feeling back to them. When she turned around, the ice in her eyes had melted back to the warm ocean blue that I remembered so fondly. Daniel. What's going on? I can't feel my legs. She whimpered. I looked down and immediately realized the problem. The last time I had thrown her away, she had landed on a large rock. That rock had cut open the back of her neck, and bone was sticking through the skin. I had broken her neck. It's going to be okay, Lauren. I'm right here. We're gonna make it. I tried to soothe her, but the fear in her eyes broke my heart. I knew it was all a lie. I cradled her in my arms and did my best to keep her company. After a minute, she was gone. Disappeared, just like the others. Suddenly, I was alone. When I looked back up, the seventh gate was directly in front of me, a grand sight. It reminded me of Wayne Manor in the Batman comic books, Victorian in style, elegant, and flawless. Behind it was the fabled asylum. It didn't appear to have any fire damage, as was suggested, but rather looked pristine, like it had been built yesterday. Initially, I questioned it, but it was fleeting. I knew I just had to get there. As I walked up to it, the gate opened in front of me. I stepped through, and suddenly all the noise, voices, pressure, everything was all gone. It felt normal, like I was just walking through the forest again. All of my cuts and bruises were mended, and my mind was my own. I walked to the front door of the asylum, and rested my hand upon the handle. With a deep breath, I swung it open. Standing in front of me were Kenny, Maddie, Lauren, and Andrew. I wanted to be relieved, but the sight of them made it hard. All four were battered, bloody, and crying. I tried to run to them, but an invisible force kept me from entering the asylum that held them captive. One of the dark men came from out of the shadows of the room to the right, and slashed through Kenny. He let out a guttural scream, followed by a cry for help. I pounded on the invisible wall, and screamed, but they could not hear me. Save them all, or save yourself. The familiar boom of the dark men echoed through the air, and I spun around to see the creature directly behind me. Hot breath scorching my face. For once, the presence no longer seemed menacing, but inquisitive. I tried to hit it, but my hand went right through it. What do you mean? I shouted. Save them all, or save yourself. It just repeated itself. Its bright green eyes staring into my soul. I guess I should be thankful. I had given up any hope of saving my friends, and now I had the opportunity to. I wish I could come back with them, but the dark men have made it clear that isn't a possibility. They did let me write a note though. I know you won't remember this, but I hope that you can take me seriously when I say, don't attempt the 7 gates of hell. It isn't worth it. Signed, Daniel Huntington. My name is Lauren Lopez, and this letter was delivered to my house earlier today. I don't know, it probably isn't real, but just in case I wanted to share it with you all. I don't know anyone by the name of Daniel Huntington, but the whole thing does feel kind of familiar. I have a feeling it's one of Kenny's tricks to try to get us to do something he doesn't think we will all want to do. If that was his plan though, it worked. I had never heard of the 7 gates of hell, but the 4 of us are going tonight.